Welcome to In this series, we will take Dungeons and Dragons magic and view it, or perhaps break it, with real-world science concepts. Every week, I'll be analyzing a new slice of the spell list, what these spells would actually do, how much energy they manipulate, and whether they're secretly terrifying once real math is applied. This will be an ongoing series, and today we're starting right at the beginning with Abjuration spells, levels 0 and 1. The order we're using to determine which spells are next is school level ordered alphabetically, then spells from lowest to highest. Note, not every spell in D&D can be broken down cleanly. Some are too abstract, too narrative, or too magical to convert into anything objective. But for those that do make sense, we're going all in. And hey, if you enjoy this kind of nerdy overthinking, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next episode. Alright, with that, let's get started with the Physics of D&D Spells, School 1, Episode 1, Abjuration, levels 0 to 1. Before we start crunching numbers for magic, we need to set a baseline, a conversion between the abstract D&D hit points and real-world energy. The D&D commoner has an average of 4 hit points, and for our purposes, we'll treat them as a totally average human, roughly 70 kilograms of mass. The only rule in the player's handbook that directly ties strongly to physics is fall damage. 1d6 bludgeoning damage per 10 feet. The average roll on a d6 is 3.5. So, a 10-foot fall equals 3.5 HP of damage. Let's compare that to real physics. The energy of a fall is determined using this gravitational potential equation. Energy equals mass times gravity times height. Plugging in our numbers, we get energy equals 70 kilograms times 9.81 meters per second times 3.048 meters. About 1,996 joules. Divide that by 3.5 HP and we get roughly 570 joules per hit point. Run that same equation for 20, 30, and 100-foot falls, and you'll land in the same neighborhood, around 600 joules per hit. So, for consistency and readability's sake, we'll call it 1 HP equals 600 joules. That means our 4 HP commoner can physically endure about 2,400 joules of trauma before hitting 0. Roughly the energy of 3 or 4 heavyweight knockout punches all hitting at once, or a 110-pound stone dropped from a second-story window straight onto your chest. From here on out, every time we analyze a spell's damage, we'll translate that into real-world energy using this scale. In short, if a spell deals 10 damage, that's about 6,000 joules of magical violence. Without further ado, Spell 1, Resistance. Mechanically, you touch someone and pick a damage type. The next time they take that kind of damage, it gets reduced by 1d4 hit points. Using our earlier conversion of 1 hit point equals 600 joules, that's between 600 and 2400 joules of energy cancelled out once per turn. To put that in perspective, 600 joules is about the kinetic energy of a professional boxer's punch, while 2400 joules is close to getting hit by a baseball moving over 400 miles per hour, or 643 kilometers per hour. And remember, that's per hit potentially every turn. However, the real interesting part of this spell is what kind of energy it's negating. 600 joules of kinetic energy looks like a broken rib or a nasty bruise, something mechanical. 600 joules of thermal energy, though, is enough to flash boil several grams of water. Same number, completely different effect. So when you cast resistance against fire damage, you're essentially conjuring a localized temporary heat sink, a micro shield that can absorb 2,000 joules of thermal energy in one go. Against lightning, that same energy might mean the spell is dispersing a brief surge of electrical potential, converting that current into harmless light or ozone. Against cold, the barrier is instead preventing roughly that much energy from leaving your body, halting the phase change of water in your tissues to keep you from freezing. And then there's necrotic damage, which, well, doesn't have a one-to-one real-world counterpart. If we assume it's a sort of entropic decay effect, then resistance here might be functioning as a localized anti-entropy field, counteracting about 600 to 2400 joules of tissue degradation. So even though resistance is just a cantrip, the physics suggest it's performing a complex adaptive energy manipulation every few seconds. And though it's the same spell, it can be tweaked to specifically counter the nature of a chosen threat. It can do all that and still be cast indefinitely. Pretty good for a level 0 spell, no? Now we're talking. Absorb Elements. This is one of those spells that makes you realize just how much wizards are walking physics studies. The rules say, when you take acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage, you gain resistance to that damage type until the start of your next turn. And resistance, in-game, halves incoming energy, without a cap. So in theory, if a star hit you, you die instantly. However, you'd have died having halved the energy of a stellar impact. Congratulations, you've just invented a new 40k style budget astrophysics shielding by just throwing a bunch of casters at a problem. Regardless, let's quantify this with our conversion of 1 HP equals 600 joules. If a spell or attack deals, say, 40 HP of fire damage, that's 24,000 joules. Absorb Elements casually erases half of that. So, 12,000 joules are just gone. Of course, it's not erased entirely. The spell stores it to use for added damage on your next melee swing. On your turn, your first strike releases that energy back as an extra 1d6 damage, or between 600 and 3600 joules of that same energy type. For fire damage, that's enough heat to flash boil several liters of water, or for electric damage to deliver a pulse strong enough to stop a heart several times over. Put bluntly, you could kill about 2.5 average people with just the recycled damage from getting lit on fire or zapped. Even at level 1, conservation of energy doesn't apply. Really interestingly, you get that 1d6 even if the damage absorbed, or even dealt, total was below the amount you rolled. Similarly, the amount could be hilariously lower than the damage taken, suggesting that this spell is either horribly inefficient or conjuring extra energy straight from nowhere. Anywho, this obviously isn't actually that powerful. D&D combat scales absurdly. Dragons and archmages sling out millions or even billions of joules per round, but against mundane physics, Absorb Elements is quite powerful. Here's a scenario to show you what I mean. Imagine some dagger and wand apprentice dropout jumps you. You take a hit, absorb the energy, and on your turn, you bonk him in the head and vaporize him with the equivalent of a lightning-charged stick. Here we go. One of my absolute favorites. Armor of Agathys. The spell description says, protective magical frost surrounds you. You gain 5 temporary hit points. If a creature hits you with a melee attack before the spell ends, it takes 5 cold damage. The spell ends early if you lose all these temporary hit points. That's the rulebook version. But physically, this is explosive reactive armor, the kind used on tanks. Except it's made of arcane ice and doesn't turn you into a red mist upon detonation. When something strikes you, the frost layer releases a violent counterburst of energy, throwing that attack back and sending a pulse of magically cold shrapnel into the attacker. Using our baseline of 1 HP equals 600 joules, 5 temporary hit points means the barrier absorbs roughly 3,000 joules of incoming energy, more than the kinetic energy of a Desert Eagle's 58E, and depending on the load and barrel length, 2 times its energy. But this is the interesting part. If this were real physics, your armor exploding outward like that should fling you backward with equal force. Newton's third law isn't a suggestion. However, obviously Armor of Agathys doesn't knock you across the field. That means that the spell's effects aren't just creating and redirecting energy, it's also cancelling out the equal and opposite reaction. So, under the hood, this spell has 3 effects. 1. Condensing magical energy as a buffer, or temporary hit points. Releasing the magical energy when subjected to a sufficient amount of damage. Negating the recoil of that blast so the caster doesn't take damage too. 3,000 joules in, 3,000 joules out, 0 reaction, a perfect defense system. Additionally, the spell scales. For every spell level, both the shield's capacity and its retaliatory strike increases by 5 hit points, or about 3,000 joules per level. Cast at 5th level, that's 25 temporary hit points and 25 cold damage, roughly 15,000 joules each way. Cast at 9th level, you're looking at 45 hit points and 45 cold damage, about 27,000 joules of impact negated and reflected. Enough to stop and counter the energy of a small smart car hitting you at 32 kilometers an hour or 20 miles an hour. or Mike Tyson's strongest punch repeated 16.875 times. So basically, Armor of Agathys doesn't just protect you, it grants you thermodynamic dominance. You hit me, you freeze. You push, I push back harder. It would appear that Newton's third law failed saving throw. Alright, next up, Cure Wounds. The spell is simple. A creature you touch regains 2d8 hit points plus your spellcasting modifier. Let's start with the numbers. 2d8 averages to about 9 hit points, and at 600 joules per hit point, that's roughly 5400 joules of biological damage being reversed. On a good roll, 16 hit points means about 9600 joules of recovery. The same energy as 4 full commoner's life totals, restored by a single touch. That is before including your spellcasting modifier, which for the purposes of this, I won't include due to variability. The interesting question here is what this actually looks like on a cellular level. Is the spell literally reversing the arrow of entropy, pulling time backward on the injured tissue? Or is it forcing the body to hyperaccelerate natural healing, stimulating cells into division at thousands of times their normal rate? In the case of the latter, you'd be feeding cells pure arcane energy in place of ATP, the body's molecular battery. A normal cell burns maybe 10 to the negative 19 joules per reaction. Cure Wounds is pumping in trillions upon trillions of those reactions worth of energy all at once. The result? The in-game effect of wounds closing near instantly. Torn muscle knitting itself back together, lost blood refilling faster than your heart can react to the BP change, all without heat buildup or metabolic byproducts. That means the spell isn't just providing energy, it's regulating entropy, chemistry, and cellular order simultaneously. Of course, there's a decent chance I'm wrong, and some lore book somewhere says that it's actually divine photons or an opening to the positive energy plane. Either way, the mechanism is pretty wild. In real terms, Cure Wounds is a short-range, touch-activated medical miracle that rewrites the laws of biology to erase about 10,000 joules of trauma. And while not flashy, it certainly is one of the most efficient and useful spells in the Abjuration lineup. Alright, time for one of the most deceptive spells in all of low-level magic. Snare. The description sounds quite harmless. You use a rope to make a 5-foot circle, it becomes invisible, and when something steps inside, they get yanked upward and held upside down and left dangling 3 feet off the ground. But here's the issue. The spell doesn't care about weight per se. Snare works just as well on large creatures as it does on a goblin, meaning you can grab a 4,000 pound, 1,800 kilo, beast and hoist it nearly 19 feet into the air by one leg. And the physics of that is just insane. Let's assume the creature is lifted the full 19 feet over the course of an entire 6-second turn. The energy requirement for such a thing is a simple plug and play with the gravitational potential energy equation. Energy equals mass times gravity times height, or E equals 1800 times 9.81 times 5.8, equaling 102,000 joules. That's a lot of work. The same energy is dropping a small motorbike from a second-story window, but over 6 seconds, so it's really not that much, about 1700 watts. It's still an outrageous engineering feat for the rope that weighs essentially nothing and is invisible. Realistically, the rope would need to sustain about 3,000 pounds of tension just to lift steadily. That's almost the limit of commercial steel cable being performed by a rope. Regardless of how the work is divided, for such a heavy creature, being lifted by a single leg would still cause tendons in the hip and knee to dislocate or rupture as the torque and shear on them is so high. That's not the end though. The time that the lift takes is uncertain, but likely far faster than 6 seconds. So let's see how that works out. If the lift happens over 1 second, the rope needs to accelerate that 1,800 kilos upward at over 11.6 meters per second, creating a tension force of roughly 21,000 newtons, or 4,700 pounds of pull on that single limb. Cut that down to half a second and the acceleration doubles, over 23 meters per second, with a resulting force of 42,000 newtons, or 9,400 pounds of tension. That's about the same force experienced at the base of a rocket engine test stand, concentrated around a single ankle. In the real world, the creature wouldn't be hanging upside down, it would be leaving its foot behind. The skin would deglove, muscles and tendons would tear, and the rest of the body might rocket upward following its mangled leg. That is, if it stays attached long enough for the body to go up at all. In other words, this spell should be a dismemberment machine. So that's this episode's breakdown of low-level abjuration magic through the lens of physics. From energy reflection to forced regeneration to sketchy rope physics. There's a surprising amount going on under the hood, and this is only the beginning. If you thought this was a good take, subscribe for more creature reworks, weird biology dives, and other sciencey ventures. If you thought it sucked, fair, I'll try harder next time. Got ideas for future videos? Toss them in the comments below. Either way, thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.